Trillions of dollars didn't just vanish from your paycheck. They were systematically rerouted to the bank accounts of the global elite. As union membership hit record lows, the wealth of the top 10% skyrocketed in a near-perfect mirror image. Today, we are exposing the structural engine that turned your lost bargaining power into their private fortune. Before 1970, there was a contract at the heart of American capitalism. An unspoken agreement, simple, documented. It held for 30 years without exception. Every time worker productivity rose, wages rose with it, almost exactly. For every 1% productivity increased, take-home pay increased by nearly 1%. This was not charity. This was not generosity. This was the result of 35% of American workers belonging to a union, and those unions having the power to negotiate a direct share of every productivity gain. The result was the American middle class, the largest, most prosperous middle class in the history of human civilization. A factory worker with a high school diploma could own a home, send children to college, take vacations, and retire with a pension on one income. Then something happened in the early 1970s. The two lines split. Productivity kept climbing. It has climbed every single year since. It is now nearly 80% higher than it was in 1979. Wages flatlined, adjusted for inflation. The median American worker earns roughly what their parents earned in 1979. The gap between those two lines is not empty space. It is money. Trillions of dollars of money that workers generated and did not receive. That money did not disappear. It was redirected to the people who owned the companies, the people who owned the stocks. The top 10% who today receive 47% of all national income. This is the great decoupling, and it did not happen by accident. Union membership peaked at 35% in 1954. The middle class received 52.3% of all national income. Today, 10% union membership, middle class income share 45% and falling. Harvard researchers documented this connection for decades. Their finding is unambiguous. The decline of unions directly accounts for 35% of the entire destruction of the middle class over the past 50 years. But understanding why unions fell and who made sure they fell requires understanding the mechanism that replaced them. A mechanism that redirected every dollar of productivity gain away from workers and into the pockets of shareholders. A mechanism with a name, shareholder primacy, and it was not a market force. It was a doctrine. Published in the New York Times in 1970 by a man named Milton Friedman. In 1970, economist Milton Friedman published an article in the New York Times that would rewrite American capitalism. His argument was simple. The sole social responsibility of a corporation is to increase its profits, not to pay living wages, not to invest in communities, not to treat workers fairly, maximize shareholder returns. That was it. That was the entire doctrine. Before Friedman, corporations operated on a stakeholder model. Workers had claims on the company. Communities had claims. Customers had claims. Shareholders were just one constituency among many. Friedman's doctrine dismantled that model. It gave corporations a legal and ethical framework to redirect every dollar of surplus value, every dollar of productivity gain, completely away from workers and toward shareholders. And the mechanism for doing that was already being designed. Stock buybacks. A stock buyback is when a company purchases its own shares, artificially driving up the price, directly enriching everyone who owned stock. Before 1982, stock buybacks were effectively prohibited by the SEC. They were considered market manipulation, illegal. But Ronald Reagan's SEC changed the rules in 1982 with a regulation called Rule 10, B-18. It was the exact same year Reagan fired 13,000 striking air traffic controllers. The exact same year the Taft-Hartley Act had already weakened unions for 35 years. The legal gates were opened simultaneously from both directions. Workers lost their power to negotiate. Corporations gained a new legal vehicle to extract that value and transfer it to shareholders. The financial numbers behind this shift are truly staggering. S&P 500 companies spent $942.5 billion on stock buybacks in 2024 alone. A record. The previous record was expected to be broken in 2025, with projections of over $1 trillion. In 2024, S&P 500 companies returned $1.6 trillion to shareholders through buybacks and dividends. $1.6 trillion in one single year. According to Oxfam, that is triple the combined annual income of the 27 million lowest-income households in America. The very same companies paying those shareholders were holding wages completely flat. Cutting benefits, moving production overseas. And who benefited? The top 10% of Americans own nearly 90% of all stocks. The CEO pay story makes the mechanism impossible to deny. In 1965, the average CEO of a major company earned 20 times what the average worker earned. By 2024, the average S&P 500 CEO earned 285 times the average worker. 285 times. And at the extreme end, the highest paid CEO in America in 2025 earned 6,569 times his median employee. The AFL-CIO noted that the median employee would have had to start working in the year 1740, before America was even a country, to earn what the average S&P 500 CEO made in 2024. These ratios were mathematically impossible when organized labor was strong. Unions had the institutional power to veto executive compensation. They had the power to demand that productivity gains be shared in wages. They had the power to expose the massive gap between what workers generated and what they actually received. When unions fell, the ceiling on executive compensation disappeared completely. And the mechanism that replaced union bargaining, shareholder primacy, and stock buybacks became the engine of the greatest upward transfer of wealth in modern history. When domestic union busting proved insufficient, capital found its ultimate escape. It went global, and American manufacturing was decimated. If workers in America still had some residual power to organize, the solution was simple. Move the jobs to countries where they had no power at all. No unions, no minimum wage, no environmental regulations, no labor protections of any kind. Since 1979, U.S. manufacturing employment has fallen from 19.5 million workers to under 13 million. Those jobs were not primarily automated. They relocated to Mexico, to China, to Vietnam, to wherever labor was cheapest and workers were least protected. The workers who remained in America could not effectively strike. If they pushed too hard, the jobs would simply move again. This is the global arbitrage trap. Capital is borderless, workers are not. And that asymmetry, built deliberately over decades of trade agreements, corporate tax structures, and regulatory frameworks, is the final mechanism that cemented the wealth transfer. The top 10% use their borderless capital and their digital assets to capture gains in markets everywhere on Earth. The bottom 90% remained tethered to local wages and local economies that were competing against the cheapest labor on the planet. And in 2026, artificial intelligence has given the same structural logic a new form. AI does not strike. AI does not organize. AI does not demand benefits or pensions or sick leave. AI does not age or require health insurance. The same logic that sent jobs to Vietnam in the 1990s is now being used to replace workers with algorithms in 2026. Automation is not the story of progress. It is the latest iteration of the same extraction mechanism. The removal of human bargaining power from the equation. The result is a world where 10% of American workers belong to a union, the lowest since before the Great Depression. Where S&P 500 companies returned more money to wealthy shareholders in 2024 than in any year in the history of financial markets. Where the median American worker's purchasing power is barely higher than it was in 1979. Where the top 10% own 47% of all national income, and climbing. Someone made each of the decisions that produced this outcome. The Taft-Hartley Act did not write itself. The National Association of Manufacturers wrote the playbook, publicly, on the record. Reagan did not fire 13,000 air traffic controllers by accident. It was a deliberate signal to every corporation in America. The SEC did not open stock buybacks by coincidence in the exact same year unions were crushed. The trade agreements that enabled offshoring were negotiated by people who knew exactly what they were doing. These are not conspiracy theories. They are documented decisions made by documented people with documented financial interests in the outcome. The question is not whether this happened. The question, as always, is whether the people it happened to understand the mechanism clearly enough to recognize when it is happening again. The explosive wealth of the global top 10% is not the result of innovation. It is not the reward for superior productivity. It is a direct withdrawal from the collective pocket. Trillions of dollars, rerouted systematically over 70 years. This is sovereign. Every week we pull back the curtain on the systems of power and money that shape the world you live in. If this surprised you, subscribe. New documentary every Thursday.